Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle. I welcome financial support for small farmers during this bad weather. Unfortunately for them and for society in general, the weather is going to keep getting worse, and farming is going to become more and more difficult due to climate change. Yesterday at the Climate Committee, we heard presentations from the authors of Ireland's Climate Change Assessment, an official government report. They told us that average temperatures in this country are already about 1 degree higher than the early 20th century. 2022 was the hottest year on record, and then came 2023. Already, this 1 degree rise has led to an increase in heavy precipitation extremes and 7% more annual rainfall. The flooding last autumn is an example of that. The near constant rain since last July, leaving fields across the country waterlogged and unsuitable for sowing crops or grazing, is another. The authors of Ireland's Climate Change Assessment warned that if effective action is delayed, we're looking at 3 degrees of heating by the end of the century. They warned that this would leave the Irish climate unrecognisable. If flooding and an inability to sow crops or graze cattle is the result of 1 degree of warning, imagine the catastrophic impact that 3 degrees will have. This is a government report. The Department of Agriculture should be paying us just as much attention as the Department of the Environment. The Minister should be responding to the bad weather as one of the impacts of climate change on farming, because that is what it is. Instead, incredibly, he is responding by doubling down on a model of industrial agriculture that is the second biggest cause of the climate crisis globally and the leading cause in this country. A quarter of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock farming. More than 90% of that is for export. It isn't for people here to eat. The Minister's own Food Vision Group recommended 2 years ago that the number of dairy cattle would have to reduce by 65,000 a year for the next 3 years to have any hope of reaching our emissions reductions targets. They recommended a voluntary exit and reduction scheme be introduced to compensate dairy farmers. The ICMSA have said that, quote, this created an expectation and farmers began making preparations on the basis that the scheme was on the way. And that would have been absolutely appropriate. But then last week, the Minister confirmed that there will be no voluntary exit and reduction scheme. Not only that, the government will be the only EU state to attempt to keep the nitrates derogation. Every other EU state has recognised the reality of water pollution and the climate crisis and realised that the derogation has to go, but not Ireland. A press statement from the Minister on the 17th of April states that, in light of continued challenging weather conditions, he is extending the deadlines for nitrates derogation applications. It is insanity that the Minister is responding to flooding caused by climate change by enabling big dairy farmers to make both climate change and water pollution even worse. Floods wash nitrates from fertiliser and animal waste into our rivers, into our lakes, into our streams. So what's the purpose of the nitrates derogation? It is to enable big dairy farmers to overstock their land to maximise profits, both for themselves and for the dairy industry. And to hell with the costs for water quality, biodiversity or the climate. That is why the bosses of the dairy industry are so hell-bent on keeping it. Earlier this month, the CEO of Tirlawn, Jim Bergen, said, the focus has to be on 2 things: how we support our farmers through the current climatic conditions and how we retain the derogation. Let's fight on our backs to hold the derogation. The same contradictory focus has been adopted hook, line and sinker by the Minister for Agriculture. Like every other Minister for Agriculture before him, he is not so much a Minister for Agriculture as a Minister for big farmers and agri-business. The Minister seems to believe that both water pollution and climate change With them, it's possible to both just keep doing the same thing over and over, but somehow we will get a different result. The majority of ordinary people, both urban and rural, are more realistic. A recent survey carried out by Friends of the Earth and Ireland Thinks found that 82% of people think that we should be paying farmers more for what we need most from the land: local food, clean water and less climate pollution. 50% also think that we should be supporting farmers to diversify away from beef and dairy, compared to only 37% who disagreed. These are the types of approaches that the Minister should be advocating. Instead, he bows to industry pressure and pretends that business as usual can continue. Last year, Dairy Industry Ireland, the representative body for the big milk processors, essentially threatened the Minister with being sued if he followed the Food Vision Group's advice and went ahead with a voluntary exit and reduction scheme. They claimed that they were encouraged by government policy to invest billions in milk processing to cater for milk volume growth. So they say they have a case for compensation if milk output shrinks due to a cattle reduction scheme, and this cuts the return on their investment. Where have we seen such tactics before? By big oil and gas. They also threaten to sue if governments take meaningful action to phase out fossil fuels, because that would reduce their return on investment and leave them with stranded assets. It's the reason that all across Europe, countries are leaving the Energy Charter Treaty so that big oil and gas can no longer sue them for taking effective climate action. The government must take the same approach towards big dairy and the dairy industry. We cannot allow a wealthy elite to hold us all over a barrel and demand either that we bail them out for their bad investments, or we give them a licence, call it a derogation, to continue to pollute. Instead, we need to direct the billions needed for a just transition in farming towards those who need it: small farmers. Not the billionaire bosses of the meat and dairy industry, like Larry Goodman, who want us all to pay for their gambling debts. To do that, we need to nationalise the food processors and the big agribusiness so that they can be redirected towards supporting small farmers as part of a climate-neutral, eco-socialist food system that enhances biodiversity instead of undermining it.